Hi there! I'm back with another classic, which is Peter Pan. It's a book I'd never read myself before last week, and I had all these ideas about what it might be about, what it would be like to read such a famous book about escaping to Neverland, and I was quite surprised. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and it feels like I haven't recorded an episode in ages, but I think that's because I uploaded the last one on a Monday for some reason, rather than the usual Thursday. But we're back, and like I said, I've got a classic for you. Peter Pan is one of those stories which I feel so many of us kind of grow up with. The boy who flies, the boy who never becomes a man, Neverland, Wendy, the Lost Boys, Hook. It's all a part of kind of our pop culture awareness, I think. Also because of the Disney movie, of course. So when my book club suggested that we give this book a go, I was like, yeah, let's do it. Why not? And then I had the weirdest reading experience, where on the one hand, I very much enjoyed it, and on the other hand, everything made me go, oof, oof. So today you're going to get some of my slightly scrambled thoughts, perhaps, on this book, and we're also going to talk about what it means to read classics and how to be aware of the time period in which they were written, etc. So let's dive in. Before I dive into the plot with you, it's worth maybe slightly explaining the extensive backstory to the Peter Pan that we think we know. So the author of Peter Pan, the originator of this figure, is J.M. Barrie, who was a Scottish writer and playwright. He first began telling stories of Peter Pan to the sons of a friend, who he later on kind of unofficially adopted. More about that later. And he just started telling them stories about the boy who can fly, the boy who never grows up, and it was more kind of, entertainment for children he knew. And then he began putting this character into his writing as well. So the first time the Peter Pan character appeared was in a 1902 novel by Barrie called The Little White Bird. A little later, he then used this in a play, a stage play, called Peter Pan or the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, which premiered in 1904. And then in 1911, he adapted this play into a novel called Peter and Wendy. And that is the novel that I read. And the novel is now usually known just as Peter Pan rather than Peter and Wendy. So this story has gone through some changes, although they are quite consistent. I'm just going to talk about the novel, and I don't think the play differs that much, but just so you know, there are different versions of this tale. Now, let's dive into this novel. Here are the opening lines. All children, except one, grow up. They soon know that they will grow up, and the way Wendy knew was this. One day, when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This was all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. 2 is the beginning of the end. So, Peter Pan starts with the Darling family, headed by Mr. and Mrs. Darling, and containing 3 children, the oldest girl, Wendy, then the 2 sons, John and Michael. We get a little bit of background into their family unit and the way in which Mrs. Darling was a beautiful girl and Mr. Darling won her just in time for himself. Mr. Darling, well, I'm going to talk about him a little later, but that man is a mess. And they live at number 14, and they have a St. Bernard's dog as a nanny for their kids. And every night, Mrs. Darling tells her 3 children bedtime stories. Now, there happens to be an extra listener at these bedtime stories, we find out, because Peter Pan has been visiting the Darling family to hear the stories and then report them back to the Lost Boys in Neverland. On one of these occasions where he's listening, the nanny, so the dog called Nana, she kind of spots him, and while he tries to escape, she closes down the window and severs his shadow from him. So, of course, Peter Pan has to come back for his shadow. Now, while he's trying to look for this shadow, which Mrs. Darling found and hid in a drawer because she's not sure what to do with it, Wendy wakes up and she manages to reattach his shadow because he'd been trying to do that with soap, which of course doesn't work. And she kind of uses thread and needle to bring it back to him. And Peter finds out that she knows loads of bedtime stories. And so, after a little bit of back and forth in which she offers him a kiss, but instead gives him a thimble, and he then returns that by giving her a kiss, which is an acorn, he manages to convince her to come to Neverland with him and play mother to him and the Lost Boys. And Wendy's like, oh my god, yes, I would love to do that, but can I bring my younger brothers? So they wake up John and Michael. They all learn how to fly using fairy dust because Tinkerbell is also along for the ride, and they go off. Now, how can these kids escape when they have a trusty nanny who's a dog? Well, there had been all kinds of drama that night, and Mr. and Mrs. Darling were invited to a dinner. And Mr. Darling has some confidence issues, and he wasn't happy about how careful the dog was about bedtime and those kinds of things. So he kicked the dog out, and she had to sleep in the doghouse instead of with the kids. And she's been barking all night, and she manages to escape, and she runs to the neighbor's house where the parents are having dinner, and she brings them home just in time to see their kids flying out the window. Now, during their flight, which surprisingly takes days and days and days, they have some doubts about where they're going, especially Wendy's like, what is going on? Because Peter sometimes takes these little detours, and then when he comes back, he doesn't always entirely remember them straight away. So there's something going on with Peter, but eventually they get to Neverland. And the kids kind of recognize Neverland from their dreams, and they're like, oh look, that is the tree where I do this, and that is the ship where I play blah blah blah. However, we have Tinkerbell on board, and Tinkerbell isn't a big fan of Wendy. She's like, no, I'm the woman in Peter's life. I will not have someone else come in. So Peter kind of jets off as they reach Neverland, and then Tinkerbell, who is jealous, kind of lures Wendy over to a part of the island where the pirates are in the hope that there will be a cannon shot or something that just takes her out of the sky, and then Tinkerbell doesn't have to deal with Wendy anymore. Instead, she leads them to the Lost Boys, and one of them, Tootles, accidentally shoots Wendy, and she's only just saved because the shot kind of ricochets off the acorn pendant which Peter gave her. So, at this point, everyone's reunited. John and Michael also land. Peter also lands, and they see Wendy, and thankfully she's not dead. And so she gets a little house built for her by Peter and the Lost Boys. And then all the Lost Boys kind of cuddle into this little hut, and she puts them to bed, and she becomes their mother. John and Michael become part of the Lost Boys as well. And well, they kind of join the way of life there, which means for Wendy that she is now a mother. And she needs to put them to bed, be strict about their bedtimes, about what they eat, routines. And little Michael, because he's the youngest, he needs to be put into a crib, because apparently every woman needs a baby. So from here on, we start getting a bit of an idea of how Neverland works. When we first kind of meet the Lost Boys, when they're kind of watching Peter Pan return, we get introduced to all the different ones, and then we also get to meet the pirates, including Hook and Smee, his bosun, and we get to meet the Native American tribe that lives in Neverland, all the wild animals, and we get introduced to the crocodile who ate Hook's hand, hence why he has a hook. The Lost Boys live in a kind of underground home, I'd say, between the roots of different trees, and every Lost Boy has a tree kind of measured for him so that they can easily slide through a hollow trunk into this underground home. And that's where Wendy kind of sets up her home. etc., while Peter takes the Darling Boys as well as the Lost Boys on different adventures. And it's quite fun at this point in the book. Jay and Barry's like, well, I could tell you about this adventure, or about this thing that Peter did, or about this, or about that. And that way you really get a sense that there's so much happening. But one story that he does tell us takes place at the Mermaid's Lagoon, where Peter and the Lost Boys managed to save the daughter of the Native American chief, and she is named Tiger Lily. And she'd been put on Marooner's Rock, which will flood and then she would drown. And she was put there by Captain Hook and 2 other pirates. Now, Peter Pan manages to save her, and that way he also manages to make allies out of the Native American tribe. And in the way of tricking Hook, Hook, of course, continues to be Peter's big nemesis. We also do get quite an insight into Hook. He seems like this precursor of the dark, broody, mysterious hero, even though, of course, he's a villain and he's hunting children. But we kind of get an insight into his tortured mind a little bit, and he's just obsessed with getting Peter Pan, because Peter is the one who wounded him and cut off his hands so that the crocodile could then eat it. And of course, the crocodile then also swallowed a clock. So Hook is always he's always got an ear out for the ticking of this clock, because then he knows he needs to scramble, because the crocodile now has a taste for him. Because Peter saved Tiger Lily, her kind of tribe is now willing to kind of guard his home, because they know that a pirate attack is imminent. It's going to happen. The pirates are preparing, and they kind of sit on the ground, and then the Lost Boys, Peter and Wendy, are kind of in their underground home, right? And we get quite a lot of domestic scenes here, and maybe Wendy is falling in love with Peter. I don't know. And Peter also doesn't quite know, because he doesn't grow up. So he couldn't be a father or a partner. And let's not forget, Wendy is like 11 or 10 or something. So they're very much playing house. But Peter couldn't be a grown-up. So he kind of has what he says, a son's feelings for her. And Wendy's disappointed and she doesn't know what she wants. And at a certain point, while she tells them bedtime stories, which is the whole reason that Peter brought her over, Wendy tells a story about their parents. And John and Michael have already kind of started to forget their parents, and they've started to forget that Wendy isn't actually their mother. But through her story, Wendy can kind of make them remember their parents, and then they want to go home. They've had their adventure, they're fine, but now they want to return home, right? And then the Lost Boys are like, well, I would love to go home as well, actually. I miss my mother, I think. I can't remember my mother, but I'm sure I miss her, right? So they kind of all gear up to leave. And then Peter says, well, I'm not leaving. Enjoy your journey home, but I stay here. I am not a real boy. I will not grow up. I'm not going home to parents. So there's some conflict there. And this moment of conflict is, of course, exploited by the pirates. So as the kind of all the kids except for Peter move up into the trees to get out of their underground home, they are captured by the pirates. And then Hook sneaks down one of these trees and he tries to poison the medicine that Wendy has been giving Peter, because every kid needs to be given medicine. So he puts some poison into that. And then when Peter wakes up, he wants to kind of drink this medicine as a kind of last favor to Wendy or something. But Tinkerbell has seen what has happened. And so she tells him, no, don't drink it. And Peter says, don't be ridiculous. And then as he goes to drink it, she kind of knocks it away and drinks it herself. And then she almost dies. And that's where we kind of get that famous line that fairies can be saved by children who believe in them. So in the play, this is when Peter then turns to the audience and asks all the children who believe in fairies to clap. And in the novel, we hear that Peter talks to all the kids who are currently dreaming of Neverland. And enough of the kids clap and believe, and Tinkerbell is saved. So now we have a rescue mission on our hands, because Tinkerbell also saw that all the Lost Boys and Wendy were kidnapped. Peter starts moving through Neverland, and it's very much like he's on a hunting mission. He's trying to be very quiet, and on his way, he sees the crocodile, but he notices that the crocodile isn't ticking. So maybe the clock that the crocodile swallowed has finally run out of battery or whatever. And Peter's like, wait, everyone is scared. So all the other wild animals on Neverland are scared of the crocodile. So I'll just make that ticking sound, and then none of the animals will attack me. I don't have to be as careful and quiet as I creep through Neverland, and I'll get to the ship quicker. So he starts ticking as he kind of moves through Neverland, and the crocodile's like, hey, I know that sound. So the crocodile follows him kind of quite casually. And as Peter then climbs the ship to get aboard, he's still ticking. Although he's kind of forgotten that he's doing it, but he's still doing it. And Hook and the other pirates hear the ticking. And Hook has a heart attack. He has a breakdown. He's like, oh my God, this crocodile is here. Is it aboard my ship? I don't know. So the pirates had all the Lost Boys tied up, and they were going to make them walk the plank and kill them. They were like, yes, get rid of the kids. But then Peter is aboard, and they're all looking for this crocodile. They're like, where is it? And he manages to steal keys to the chains that were keeping the Lost Boys contained, and he frees them. And they all get into this cabin. And then what happens in this cabin is very weird, because the pirates are like, there is something dreadful in the cabin. And Hook keeps sending pirates in, and they all end up dying because Peter kills them. And finally, he then also reveals himself, and he's like, it is I, Peter Pan. And Hook is like, ugh, okay. And we get this climactic battle in which all the Lost Boys, they're killing pirates. John and Michael are also fighting. I think Wendy is potentially still chained up, but she's not fighting. And eventually there's something of a duel or a face-off between Peter and Hook. And Peter gives Hook a kick in the face, and the ticking has stopped because Peter is busy fighting and sassing. And so he jumps into the water, and that's where the crocodile has been waiting. That's when we have the ending of the rivalry between Hook and Pan. Now, because the kids still had the plan that they wanted to go home, Peter's like, sure, I'll just sail this ship that we've now taken over, and we'll sail it all the way back to London. And Tinkerbell's like, why are you so happy to now let all of these kids go? Like, they are your only companions. You didn't want them to leave. But Peter has a secret plan, which we will find out more. So at this point, we also get different flashbacks back to Mr. and Mrs. Darling. And Jay and Barrie is like, wouldn't it be nice if we could already tell them that their kids are on their way home, that they will be home soon, but we can't because we would spoil the moment. And Wendy, John, and Michael want to surprise their parents. If we already assured the parents, we would ruin the surprise, and that's quite cute. But Wendy has always been so sure that her mother would never close the window to their bedroom, that she would keep that window open so they could always fly home. Well, Peter and Tinkerbell head towards the Darling home while the ship is still on its way, and they lock the window. And, well, Peter has a little bit of guilty feelings about this, so eventually he does open the window back up because he sees how upset Mrs. Darling is about her lost children. So he's like, fine, I'll relinquish these kids. So the three kids sneak back into their beds and pretend they've been there all the time, and Mrs. Darling wakes up from having fallen asleep crying, and she's like, my darlings have returned. And then Mr. Darling comes in, and the weirdest thing at this point, sorry, I have to interrupt the plot to tell you this. Mr. Darling, because he's the one who locked up the nanny back in the doghouse because of his own kind of weird feelings about being respected. Because of that, the kids managed to get away, right? So as a kind of penance, he's been sleeping in the doghouse, but not just sleeping, he's been going to work in the doghouse, and it's become a whole thing. So he's in the doghouse, and then he hears Mrs. Darling saying, oh my God, the kids are back. And so he rushes up, and Wendy, John, and Michael have also brought all the Lost Boys with them. And the Lost Boys are like, can we stay too? And they're like, okay, fine. I mean, this is a lot of kids, but we'll figure out where to put you up. And Mrs. Darling says, well, Peter, I'm willing to adopt you too. And he's like, nah, you can't catch me. You can't make me into a man. I am leaving. And we kind of get the idea that maybe Mrs. Darling also knew Peter when she was a girl. But Peter says, I'm not staying here, but I will come back in the spring. And then Wendy can come home with me to Neverland and do my spring cleaning. Isn't that what every girl dreams of? So, a year later, she's waiting for Peter to come pick her up. And he does. And they go off to Neverland. And then the year after, he doesn't come. And the year after that he does, and he has no idea that he's missed a year, that something is wrong. And it kind of turns out that, well, Peter forgets. Things that aren't in front of him don't matter to him. And so occasionally he will come back, but at a certain point he's been gone for years. But then in a kind of epilogue, he returns and he sneaks back into the house, and there is a little girl sleeping in the bed. And then he's like, Wendy, let's go, get up, time for you to do my spring cleaning. Women love spring cleaning. And it turns out Wendy has actually gotten married, and she now has a girl of her own. And that is the girl that's lying in the bed, and she's called Jane. And Peter's like, how dare you grow up? How dare you get married? This is disgusting. I feel betrayed. And then Jane says, I'll come to Neverland, and I'll be your mother, and I'll do the spring cleaning. And that's what happens. Wendy lets her go, and then kind of the last few lines of the book tell us about how years later, Jane then lets Peter take her daughter, Margaret, to Neverland. And apparently this cycle goes on and on forever. And that is Peter Pan. Now, I don't think that plot is too surprising. I think that is pretty much what most of us know that Peter Pan is about. It's about a family of kids who go off to Neverland, have adventures, fight pirates, encounter a Native American tribe, and eventually come home happily, while Peter continues to be, well, a lost boy who can fly and who never grows up. But I did not expect kind of the whole tone of the novel. So, as you maybe remember from the first lines I read at the beginning, there is quite a strong narrator who will kind of say, well, this is how things are, and this is the way that kids do or do not grow up. And the narrator kind of makes these little jokes throughout the book, jokes that kind of felt like they were for an adult audience. So it's kind of like those children's movies where the plot is technically for children, but the way in which it is told or narrated means that the parents who have to watch the film with these children, or the parents who read this book to their children, don't get too bored either. And I wasn't quite sure how to feel about this tone, because on the one hand, the kind of values of the story are incredibly conservative, and I really found myself kind of chafing against that, because the whole idea that this young girl would love nothing more than to play mother to a bunch of rambunctious little boys, well, that just doesn't sit right with me. Not every woman wants to be a mother, not every little girl wants to play mother. But that's kind of what comes forward, right? And we also see that in the marriage dynamic between Mr. and Mrs. Darling. So Mrs. Darling is absolutely devoted to her children, and Mr. Darling kind of makes a very big point out of how Mrs. Darling not just loves him, but she respects him too, because he works in finance or something. He knows about bonds. And Mr. Darling is obsessed with being just like his neighbors, being respected by his wife and by his children. And that's where his whole frustration with Nanny the dog comes from as well. He feels like she doesn't respect him. And that's why he kind of locks her away. And yeah, I did not know what to do with some of that. On the one hand, that those gender dynamics, that family dynamic, it is pulled so far that it feels like pastiche, like he's parodying it by drawing it into the extreme. But then on the other hand, there also isn't an alternative for it, because Wendy kind of continues this cycle of also letting her daughter go off and be a little mother to Peter Pan. And this is where I think, and we were talking about this in the book club as well when we discussed Peter Pan, this is where it becomes important to remember when this book was written. And these stories were conceived by J.M. Barrie around well, the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s. It was a much more traditional society, of course, and women had none of the rights that they do now. Marriage and motherhood very much were, especially for middle and upper class women, those were their only avenues, right? Throughout history, women have always worked. Working class women didn't have the choice. Like, they did not have the opportunity to sit around at home staring out the window. But for middle class and upper class women, life was a little bit more restricted in that way. They were meant to get married, pop out kids, etc. And that is an absolutely great lifestyle if that's what you choose. But if you're kind of forced into it because it's your only opportunity, well, that's not good, right? So on the one hand, I think Barrie just reflected the society around him. And then on the other hand, J.M. Barrie is a fascinating figure himself, because he doesn't really, well, maybe fit into this traditional image that he's portraying either. So like I said at the beginning, J.M. Barrie was a Scottish author and playwright. He was one of 10 children in quite a large family that wasn't very well off necessarily, but they gave him and his siblings that survived childhood an education as well. He was able to go to university, and he started telling stories at quite an early age, and therefore he also was kind of allowed to study literature. And some of his early novels were successes. He kind of switched into plays, and some of them weren't so well received, but then others were. And the Peter Pan stories were a hit, and they really set him up financially, but they also kind of overshadowed all the other work he did. But J.M. Barrie, well, he has weird relationships, I think. And I don't mean weird in a completely dismissive way, but you can find stories about how one of his older brothers died, and he happened to be his mother's favorite. And so Barrie kind of pretended to be his brother. He would act like him. He would wear his clothes, apparently. And so him and his mother had a very kind of tight bond based on their shared loss of this sibling / child. And they would tell stories about that, etc. And yeah, so that definitely is a kind of odd experience to have had in your childhood, which then also influenced the figure of Peter Pan, I think, because apparently his mother grieved this other son so much, but was also glad that he would never have to grow up, that he would be this young boy that she loved forever in the afterlife, right? So that is an interesting dynamic he had early in his life. But then Barrie was also married at some point to an actress called Mary Ansell, and they got married in 1894. And apparently their marriage was a completely chaste one. So apparently they never consummated their marriage, they never had children. And at a certain point, he did file for divorce because she had an affair with someone else and didn't want to break that off. But he did continue to support his ex-wife throughout the rest of his life, and even left her money in his will. So again, there's this kind of chaste aspect and this kind of potentially very deep love that remains, well, I wouldn't say on a surface level, because I think those are very deep affections he had, but they remain a little bit distanced in a way. So that was also a very interesting aspect to me, that maybe he also just played house with his partner. And so when Wendy and Peter and the Lost Boys are playing house, taking in these traditional roles without it ever moving into anything deeper because they're children, well, that's maybe also something he had. Perhaps he had a bit of a childlike affection himself in life. And then there's also issue is perhaps too strong a word, I don't know, but the fact of the Llewellyn Davies family. So Barrie met this family in 1897, apparently, when he met two of their sons, George and Jack, in a park with their nanny. And he was telling these kids stories, and then he became friends with the parents as well, who were called Arthur and Sylvia. And he just became like a fun uncle. And he invited them the entire family, to his kind of holiday cottage and stuff like that. And these were the kids that he told the first Peter Pan stories to. So Arthur and Sylvia Llewellyn Davies had 5 sons: George, John, Peter, Michael, and Nicholas. And these were kind of the first kids who got to enjoy Peter Pan. And then tragedy, unfortunately, did strike. So Arthur, the father, died in 1907, at which point J.M. Barrie became a lot more involved with the family because, of course, now the provider is missing and he was already making quite a lot of money from the Peter Pan story. So he helped support this family and he helped raise the kids. And then 3 years later, unfortunately, the mother, Sylvia, also died. And this is where I'm not entirely sure how this would have worked back in the 1900s. But J.M. Barrie kind of became a trustee and a guardian. And this is what the mother also wanted. She wanted Barrie, along with her own mother and her brothers, to look after the children. But apparently J.M. Barrie also kind of put himself in the will a little bit more than he really was. But anyway, he ended up unofficially kind of adopting these children, looking after them, along with the nanny they had previously, along with input from the other kind of family members that were still around. And there have been a lot of rumors, there's been speculation, conjecture about J.M. Barrie and his relationship with these children, not entirely dissimilarly to how there has been a lot of suspicion towards Lewis Carroll over his relationship with Alice Liddell, which inspired Alice in Wonderland. There is no proof, as far as I could find, that anything weird happened there. No weird thoughts at the time, etc. He was just a man who got very invested in this family and wanted to help support it. And some of those sons spoke out later when they were older and said, no, this was all above board. His kindness towards children is also supported, I would say, by the fact that he bequeathed the copyright to all of his Peter Pan work to the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, which is famously a hospital for children. And they've been able to benefit from kind of all the royalties that these works have brought in order to assist sick children. So with all of that background, that's also something I partially brought into the book, but also only learned afterwards. And I find that it just confuses me more about the gender dynamics, the potential social commentary in the book, because we have this extremely overdrawn portrayal of a nuclear family life, of a man, a woman, 3 children, and the relationships between them, how codependent the man is on getting his sense of self-worth from the respect his family ought to have for him, this maternal gentleness, but also kind of wistfulness that defines Mrs. Darling, young Wendy, who apparently dreams of nothing more than being a mother, John and Michael, who forget their parents so soon, and yeah, I don't know how to feel about it because the inner feminist in me is absolutely riled up against it. And yet, it does also feel like it is critiquing it. And then if you look at J.M. Barrie's life and the way in which that was perhaps quite non-traditional as well, he never had his own family. He absolutely dedicated himself to the arts. And yeah, then I just can't help but be confused about where this novel is trying to go. And I, for example, wouldn't know if I had young children, if I had a young daughter, if I wanted to read this to her in case she got the wrong idea and thought that I wanted her to just be a mother and kind of nothing else, that was the purpose of her life, to go spring clean for a boy. But on the other hand, it is a delightfully fun story. So the way in which J.M. Barrie, as the narrator, has all these little asides, these little jokes, when he kind of says, okay, which of these adventures should I tell you? Which would give you the best insight? It is really fun and imaginative. There's a lot of creativity here. But it is just also very much of its time. Another aspect in which that comes forward very strongly, I would say, is in the depiction of Native Americans, something I don't think J.M. Barrie had any experience with. I don't think he knew any Native Americans, but there's also a particular name that he gives to the tribe, which nowadays is considered a slur. So you can very much tell there as well that it is of its time. The way they are described as kind of these noble savages, it doesn't really hit the right spot anymore. But I think, as with all classics, as I promised, we do have to talk about reading classics in modern times. As with all classics, you have to read it within its own time. You can't expect a book that is 200 years old almost to have the same moral, social ideas, etc. that we have now, especially if nowadays we can't even agree on how to treat each other, right? We, in a sense, feel a lot more advanced in our 21st century when it comes to women's rights, civil rights, equal treatment, etc. But look at the culture wars exploding everywhere, right? With people still getting upset about things that we feel like they should be acceptable. So we can't expect a 21st century sensibility in a book from the 18 and 1900s. We just can't. We can, however, look into the book and try and differentiate between the different voices at play. So one of the things that I think is really important when it comes to being able to read critically, but also decisively, is to differentiate between the different voices you get. So in a book, you will have a character and they'll say something. That is that character saying it. You will have a narrator, for example, who says, I am telling you this story, blah, blah, blah. That is another voice. The narrator is not the same as an author because that is a person completely outside of the story world that is being built. So you can't equate the narrator of Peter Pan with J.M. Barrie kind of one for one. You know, they're both creators of the story, but J.M. Barrie does kind of stand outside of it as the author. So when a narrator in a book or a character in a book says something, that doesn't necessarily mean the author agrees with that. You do need to look at the context. So for example, when all of these characters seem to have such a strong investment in this nuclear family, in the mother role, in the father as a provider role, well, maybe J.M. Barrie doesn't agree with that. And the fact that it is so strong is actually him critiquing it. That is always something to bear in mind when you look at books. If a book says something you don't entirely like, question on what level it is being said. So I had the same experience, for example, reading Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, where a lot of things I'd heard kind of made me think, oh, this is maybe a racist book because it's about slavery and about colonialism and imperialism. And then I read the book and I realized that yes, some of the characters in this book are racist. They are the worst kind of people. Even our narrator, our main character, isn't the best of people per se, but that is what the book is about. The book itself is not pro-slavery, just as Lolita is not pro-pedophilia, right? You have to read behind some of the words. You have to separate author from narrator, from character, and look on what level of the story what is happening. Bringing all of that, I'm aware how long I've been talking as well, but bringing all of that to Peter Pan maybe feels like a bit too much because it's a children's book. But it is in the stories that we tell children, that we raise the next generations with, that we put some of our social codes, some of the things we think are important that we want to carry on. And I think here, well, I'm still not entirely sure what message J.M. Barrie was trying to get across. If it was meant to be pure fun, pure imagination, or not, because the fun and the adventures, well, they aren't that fun. I'm not going to lie, Peter Pan is a little psycho. Like, that boy is completely detached from his humanity. And reading him at times is scary, and I think he is meant to be as well. I don't think J.M. Barrie wrote him to be a little rascal. I think he wrote him to be potentially dangerous. So what does that mean? Well, these are all questions that are still floating in the back of my mind, and that's why I would have to say that Peter Pan is a very interesting story and a very interesting read. Although some of it really rubbed me the wrong way, it is kind of triggering questions for me, and it is making me think about certain things. And we spoke about this book for over an hour in our book club, although we kind of weren't expecting that, I think. So yeah, it's a fascinating classics. I don't know how I would feel exposing children to this without context, but I think that is true for many things, right? Everything requires its context. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Peter Pan is a fascinating story. I can see why it has had such an impact on pop culture, and I think it's probably a little more complex than we sometimes give it credit for. I'd love to hear what you think about it. If you've read the books, maybe it's different when you read them as a kid, or if you've only seen the movies and are quite surprised that there's actually so much death and killing and murder in the book, because there is. So yeah, now I'm rambling, but I'll leave it there. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.